My kids say I can't cook. They actually hate my cooking. My friends, when I try to find a restaurant, I always fail. So given that I can't cook or find restaurants, I've learned that the only way to be a good chef is to work with many people and to partner it, to move together with everyone. So that's kind of the framework. But let me now be philosophical in my 20 minutes. In the conspiracy theory, we talked about the issue of knowing. If you go back to Shapiro's work and Kafka, there's a creature. It sees fear, an enemy is coming. It burrows, it burrows. But after a while, it can no longer tell who's friend, who's foe. Is the sound it's hearing of the enemy, or is it creating its sound? How then to distinguish the act of knowing from that which is to be known? Australia just is buying, I think, $50 billion of nuclear submarines. It's placing its bets on declining hegemons instead of the rising hegemon. But more importantly, it's placing its bet that the future is one of fear. The future is not a friend. It's made a decision. That decision is what we want to challenge personally and collectively. And I want to ask all of us, can the future be our friend? The way I come to this is, of course, from macro history. Those of you know our work. And the first thing from macro history, yes, we're in a pandemic, but where will we be in 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 years? Carter Fish tells us if we want to know the long-term future, look at two things. Is your governance structure planetary, or are you using renewals? Are you using renewables? If you don't, then you know exactly what's going to happen. You'll be a type A, type 0 civilization, and in fact, you won't progress. You'll blow up, and thus the reason why we don't have first contact, empirical evidence of first contact, is civilizations throughout the cosmos blow themselves up. Our first recipe is manage the contradiction, create a planetary society, get away from nuclear, from fossil fuels, go towards renewables. If we can do that, we can move to a type 1, then type 2, and eventually over 1,000 years, a type 3 civilization, which I'll close with, is essentially a far more spiritual civilization living in extreme abundance. It's mastered energy, it's mastered the empirical world, even though real is nervous of that, as we all are. Is this possible, this shift? Every day I spend time with spiritual people who hate each other. And that becomes our tension. We're ego people, we're attached to our country, and yet almost in the futures community, we're planetary people. We want to see ourselves as a species and even more than a species. So this becomes the big issue. Can we resolve the systems that create identity which is fixed to, as Jim said, systems that allow identities that are fluid? As Buckminster Fuller said, I am becoming, how are we becoming? So that's the first macro historical lesson. Manage the contradiction, be aware of it, live in it. The second is from Ibn Khaldun, the founder of sociology, watch out for decline. Decline is embedded in all our thinking and all we are. As someone who's 63 and plays basketball, I see my knees declining every day and I do my best to arrest the decline, but I'm not stupid enough to know that the knees won't continue to decline. But at the same time, be aware of progress. If you go back to the 12th century, Joachim of Fior, the Christian monk, he took the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost and said, no, don't see this as three parts of divinity, see this as stages in human history. From physical, mental to spiritual civilization. Auguste Comte and Spencer took some of that and said, make sure you see the future as linear, as progressive. Don't get lost in decline. Always try to imagine a future that's more progressive. Of course, they got lost in neoliberalism, but we can challenge that. Peter Sorokin comes in and says the big recipe is be patient. Civilizations go through pendulums, sometimes modernist, sometimes religious. As they go to one extreme, they shift back. Learn patience, learn patience. With one city I was working with, it was a green ecological pedestrian city. A new mayor came in, he said, no, I want tunnels, roads, and cars. The transport people said, what do we do? 10 years of our visioning, our scenarios are going up in smoke. I said, be patient, your time will also come. Understand the pendulum. But then who will create the future? If it was decline, linearity, and cyclical, and pendulum. Toynbee says the creative minority, find out who they are. Who are the ones, as much as real challenges the vanguard? This is suggesting we can be the vanguard through our imagination. And it can be the vanguard that challenges the old soup and creates a different soup. If we don't do this, then we get imitation. Imitation, let's do it the way we did before. Imitation is cyclical. Nothing really changes. The old pattern keeps on coming back. Authoritarianism continues and continues. One media corporation is exchanged for another media corporation. Watch out for the cyclical. And thus you get the Asian philosopher Sarkar, who suggests, yes, history is cyclical. Warrior, worker to warrior, to intellectual, to cumulative capitalist. And then, as Jose Ramos did in his PhD, the peer-to-peer revolution, where workers unite globally, and of course, the global discipline society that most likely will emerge. But the real issue is, can you become the exception to evolution? Evolution is created by the exceptions in history, not those that follow the cycle. So who is that? He suggests it's those who can serve, who can protect, who can challenge injustice, those who inspire, and those who innovate through financial capital. We use our hard work, we protect, we come up with the ideas, and we know how to use money wisely. They become, he calls it in Sanskrit, the sadvipras, who take the cycle and make it progressive. And this is where Pollock reminds us. The recipe is have a positive image of the future, ensure agency. If you don't have the positive image, if you don't have agency, you will decline. The Khaldunian decline will hit you because you believe structure overwhelms agency. And of course, structure is real. But if you always believe it's going to overwhelm, then why would you act? That's what leads to collective depression and the mental illness rates we're seeing all over the world because of the pandemic. So that's at the galactic level, the next 50, 100, 1,000 years. But now let's go smaller, organizational. The organizational level, let's remember Oliver Markley. He said, look at the emerging image. The image leads. 60s, they talked about the green revolution, participation, new types of democracy, economic democracy. Those were hippie ideas, the vegan revolution. And of course, now today, we're living some of those ideas. Those ideas have contradiction, as we know from the neo-Nazi movement, now aligning perfectly with the wellness and yoga movement in terms of anti-vaccination and challenging the rights of minorities and African Asian nations to have prevention. In organizations, what we've learned is find the infection, the carriers of infection, the change agents. They're 10 to 30%. Find them, work on them. That's the recipe. Find those who are asleep, let them sleep. They don't want to be awakened. Don't waste your energy. Then find the 30% who are possible carriers. You have now 50% almost with you as you lead towards the new future. Disrupt the old, create the new. And what do you do with the resistors, the quarantine? She says, I said, Bryce says, quarantine them. You don't fight, you manage them through quarantines, which of course is a different word now. You don't focus on the past, you focus on where they're going. Don't let them frame the debate, you frame the debate. Is this empirically true? Our clear, dearest friend who passed away recently, Patricia Kelly, she says, yes, the empirical evidence supports that, but says, don't see the resistors as ontological category, find what they're resisting. Why don't they want a greener future? Why don't they want a more spiritual future? Why don't they want a more equitable future? What's there? How can you work to transform it? Science magazine supports the evidence. The recipe works. 25% of the population need to take a stand in an organization before large-scale social change occurs. Find the 25%. That becomes the personal mission. Is whether that's in the canteen, as Arndt says, or a restaurant nearby, or in fact, a new type of restaurant you create. Future studies, I would argue, in itself is a recipe. And we know that recipe. I won't waste your time on that. There's different approaches, but all say, yes, it's literacy with methods. Use them wisely. In this recipe creating, first, challenge the youth future. As Khaldun said, blindly following ancient customs and traditions does not mean that the dead are alive, but that the living are dead. We have to be clear, what's not working, how do we challenge it? In our own work, we have to integrate the disowned, as Mayim has said so beautifully. What we push away becomes our problem. Who we hate, we become, as Homer said. What are we pushing away? When I work with nurses, they say we push away the wolf, thus our salaries are lower. We love and love and love. We don't know how to make boundaries. This integration alternative futures to me is a far more powerful way to do scenarios than anything Shell invented, given the disaster Shell has created for the world. Look at, again, Jose Ramos's PhD, where he explores integrated scenarios. And thus, of course, CLA. Find the deep story. Use the deep story, link it to measurement. Stories just as stories become empty words. Measurements just as measurements only measure the past. Every organization, I know unless I get the CFO on board, the project is dead. They measure the new future, ensure story plus measurement. With one group of a board of directors, I remember I was working with them. I said, what's your problem? They said, we're bludgeoned by the present, bludgeoned by the present. The meeting was for 3 hours. Half hour before the end, the CEO said, sorry, I have to take an urgent call. I said, you're reinforcing your story. You're bludgeoned by the present and you're ensuring the futures project fails by staying in your story. I said, go ahead, take your call. You've wasted all of our times. And he stopped. Wonderful as he was, he took a deep breath. He said, aha. He came up with a new story, a flock of eagles, can see far and can see detailed. They've flown brilliantly the last 3 years. Why? I call them every year, every few months. We have purpose. We have focus. We're not bludgeoned by the present. We're flying like eagles now. My colleague at Queensland Deaf Services, he suggests the old story was in fact losing my hearing. The new story says is gaining my deafness. As Gohua Chen said, these questions are uncomfortable. When he told me that, I said, wow, so gaining my deafness now is a future, is now a new type of friend, a friend I would never expect. Because our challenge is to be reflective practitioners, to be aware what our story is as we enter the room. We're mindful about who we are as we work with others. That becomes a critical part of it. This takes a painful way to learn. With one large organization, we were doing this amazing visiting stuff, amazing scenario stuff. One person in the room, one of the vice presidents, spent the day attacking me and Rob Burke. Finally, at 3:30, I said, why are you doing this? She goes, what's the story of our organization? She said, it's Snow White and Prince Charming. We're waiting for Prince Charming, government funding. And then I said, so who are you? She said, you know who I am. I said, who are you? I am the wicked stepsister. And I knew straight away the project was over. I had no way to link her metaphor with the national strategy. Their project disappears. Hundreds of thousands of dollars disappeared in a matter of 3 seconds. I had no way to include her story within our work. And thus all our projects have vision, have strategy, and have the narrative dimension, as Kalyani so brilliantly said. So we have to have our own story. One leading Australian innovator, he said he spent his entire life in the federal government chasing innovation. He said he was always chasing the white rabbit, telling others to be innovative, and finally it hit him when he did the sealing of the self. He must become the white rabbit himself. He must do the inner work. It's not them. I think this is what Rio was going on about. We're part of the change. The strategic foresight always fails. Strategic foresight always fails because we're doing it to them. We're not part of the story. We're having a 19th century Newtonian world, a lever pushing the planet instead of in a Gaian polity where we're part of the contradiction. We're integrating our dissonant. So what's my conclusion then? Conclusion one is from Mazlan Atman, the brilliant physicist who used to be in charge of the UN in terms of first contact. When I talked to her about the contradictions of governance and energy, of identities that are deep and spiritual, but also materialistic and nationalistic, indeed evil, she goes, Sohail, you misunderstand the long-term future of the planet. I go, what is it? She goes, evolution will favor the efficient. Evolution always favors the efficient. The nation state is inefficient, it will disappear. Capitalism is inefficient because there's no wealth caps, no maximini, it will disappear. Patriarchy is inefficient because it allocates identity and resources non-productively, it will disappear. Religionism, not spiritualism, will disappear because someone is excluded and shunned. Materialism will disappear because it does not allocate purpose and joy. It's purpose with bliss. And I looked at her and she's a theoretical physicist. She wasn't saying these are values. She was saying evolution favors the efficient. This is our natural direction in the long run. So this leads me to the last part of the recipe. Be the future you wish to see. Live and act in terms of the world you want. That's what backcasting is about. Sarkar, who I did my PhD, he said, we're moving from the world of material dimensions being defining to ideas being defining, and eventually moving towards the spiritual age where it's purpose, love, connection, the body as a thinking body, the brain as a loving brain. That's the next phase in human history, in human future. Now, you may or may not agree, but this was critical. He wanted us to think the future's bright, we start to imagine it, and thus we start to create it. But of course, Sarkar was not stupid, talked about the cycle of power oppressing others. So remember the words of Wang Chu. Isn't it here that you take a half step wrong and wake up 1,000 miles astray? These recipes are great. The metaphor is wonderful, but we know very well these are critical steps we're taking right now. Will we fragment as a species? Or will we evolve in terms of nature, humans, technology, and spirit, co-evolving to some new direction in humanity? So let's reframe the recipe. 1, be aware of contradictions, energy, and governance. 2, watch out for the used and disowned in our own life, in our organizational life. What are we pushing away? What do we hate that can come back towards us? 3, focus on progress, on the progressive, on what could change, what can be more inclusive. 4, ride the pendulum. There are pendulums, there always will be pendulums. They go back and forth because that's the nature, the structure of evolution. 5, create the spiral and become the exception. Evolution is created by the exceptions, the carriers of the new infection. Engage in future thinking, as we're all doing here. Find your story, link it to the material world. Everyone has an inner story, find that story. Create the future from your core story. That story guides, it leads, it has power, it has mythos in it. Be and feel the change, focus on the vision. And there's the issue of agency. In times of chaos and bifurcation, what do? Do we go towards conspiracy, where it's always one ethnic group that's strong, or do we go towards inclusion, deep inclusion? We're on a planet together, making wise decisions. So as much as possible, agency for the good of all. The 10th is the critical part, avoid all recipes. We want novelty, we want emergence. The 9 steps I have, please throw them away. When my kids were young, and I said they didn't like my cooking. How do I keep them engaged? With my son, I would make him the same sandwich, but on the sandwich, I would cut recipe number 22. Same sandwich next day, recipe number 45, recipe number 73. And every day he couldn't wait to see what number I would put there. That was the best I could do. So whatever we can, wherever we can, we have recipes, but in effect, all of us are very clear we're entering novelty. As Dater said, we're going in directions which of course are unknown. Macro history and futures is a way to put some structure and enhance agency as we create new futures. Thanks so much.